Hey everyone! In this video I will go over the process behind my latest project, arriving to Techno City. And I will focus on answering in more details the questions I got from Reddit. Mainly how to achieve a sense of massive scale, and go over some of my texturing workflow. Thank you for those of you who showed this piece on Reddit, by the way, I really appreciate it. First, to talk a bit about the project itself, this piece was inspired by The Inkle, a graphic novel written by Jodorowsky and illustrated by Mobius. Specifically this image showing the character arriving to Techno City. I first attempted simply recreating this image, but I was not satisfied with it. It was too empty, and getting the same look would have required too much cheating around the colors and lighting, and I wanted my work to stay quite realistic. So I wanted to get closer to the train. I played around with the camera and format of the image, and I got to this interesting angle pretty quickly. I knew I wanted to have a cityscape instead of empty terrain, and I would have to model the train a bit more detailed now that we are so close to it. So I gathered a few references in PureRef that we can see right here. So I have my base references from the comic book, and then I gathered some references of the type of city I would want to make, something quite dystopian, sci-fi, a bit of references for the train itself, for the railway around it, train station, some of the buildings for the city, mainly for the shape IDs. I made a building that is quite similar to that one, and then I just have some work in progress frames at the bottom. So in the end, here is what my scene looks like in Blender's viewport. Now, to get to the questions I got from Reddit, one that came back often was how to get a sense of massive scale. For more details on that, I really recommend watching this video from Critical Giants that cover this topic quite well, but I can give you some tips that applied in this particular project. First, having a scale reference. Something that is always good to have when making environments is a reference of something that we can immediately recognize and know the scale of. The simplest thing is to place a character, because everybody can identify a person and have an idea of the average human height. But this can also be an element like a lamppost, a window, a car, just something that we are used to. Here, for example, we have a few elements that we are familiar with. We have a character, some type of lamppost, we have railings. Now that we have this foundation of scale with elements that we know, it is easier to create a sense of scale by comparison. When we see this lamppost that we associate with something quite big in real life, looking so tiny next to this structure, it really gives us that impression of massive scale. The camera. The way you place your camera and which settings you use will also play a role in giving a sense of scale. A good rule for camera placement when doing visual effects is to have the camera somewhere a human being could actually be to take the shot. What often gives up a really CG feel is the camera being just randomly in the air or in no logical location, or for animated shots, even in big movies, having cameras doing impossible movements, just flying randomly in the air, really breaks the realism and the immersion in the scene. Something that the first Pacific Rim does well is to keep the camera grounded, which immediately makes the mechas and kaijus look huge. So here, by staying at character level on the train, you get a similar perspective as him, and you feel the massive scale of the structure he is approaching. Also, composition plays a part. The fact that the massive structure in the foreground is not entirely visible, or the top part is out of view, it really gives a sense of how big it is that it can't even fit in the frame. Now, for camera settings, using a wide lens can help as it makes elements close to the camera will look big and distant elements look smaller. It creates a feeling of greater distance between the foreground and the background. A longer focal length will usually flatten the depth. Now, there are exceptions and you can get a feeling of distance with a longer focal length. It's really a case-by-case scenario and depends on the effects you're trying to get. But usually a wide lens can make it easier to achieve a sense of epic scale. And finally, atmospheric perspective. This is an easy one. Just by adding volumetrics to your scene, you will quickly give a feel of distance to your environments. It will simulate the atmospheric perspective that you can see in real life. Now be careful to not overdo it, but a subtle use of volumetrics will definitely help get that distance feeling. I also got a few questions regarding texturing. First, where do I get my textures? I often use the Easy PBR add-on in Blender, which is basically just linking to the ambient CG library. You can easily download materials in the resolution and format that you prefer, and you can either assign the material directly to your object, or you can bring a node group in your current material. This is useful if you want to mix multiple textures or material together. I also use images from textures.com that I've had for a while in my hard drive. I think now it's unfortunately subscription based only, even for low res texture, which sucks. But real life image based textures are always best if you want to achieve realism. You can try to find textures on websites like Unsplash, Pexels or Pixabay, and if they are not seamless, there is a lot of tutorials to make seamless textures, either in Blender directly or in Photoshop. But you can also use them as overlays or decals, for example. Other add-ons or sites I sometimes use, but not as often, are the Substance add-on, linking to the Substance library. Sanctus, there is a free version with a few materials. BlenderKit has some user-made materials. Some are free, some you can access if you get the premium version of BlenderKit. Polyhaven also has some free materials on top of their great HDRIs. But in general, PBR materials are nice, but if you want to achieve realism, it's always better to go with real image-based textures. On this project in particular, I also relied heavily on maps I created with JSplacement. It is not actively supported anymore, but you can still find it on GitHub, I think. I will put the link below. It is a quite well-known little software now, but in case you don't know it, here is a quick look at it. Alright, so when you open it, it's just this little software. You can click here and select the version you prefer. So the classic version has quite a lot of different types of elements. You just click or use the hotkey and it will just generate a map with a random pattern with these elements, so you can control the number of iterations you want, more or less shapes, and for each shape you can enable or disable them as you prefer. Like if you don't want any of those and just want basic cubes, for example, you can control the scale of each shape, and then you can just save height, save normal. I usually just save the height, but you also have version 2 that has some quite more sci-fi pattern. This is mostly what I used in my project. So you have in here also different versions. You have the classic set, you have a crop pack, which looks more like computer inside electronics details. Big data looks more like grid shapes. Agromag similar to the classic set, and same thing here. You can just adjust the background brightness. So for example, if you have a lot less iterations and you set it as black, like for example if you want to use that as like an alpha map, having it as black directly will make it fully transparent. And if you plan on using it as like a displacement or bump, then leaving it at kind of like a middle gray value will just serve as the baseline of the bump. You can also toggle colorizer on it. There is different presets, so you can choose and you can use that as like a base color for your material. And then you have other types, velvet. I don't really use those a lot. Wire, like, can be useful to create some kind of grids, or even like road patterns can be useful. And then dot grid can also be useful to fake lights. That's actually what I started with, to fake lights on or windows in buildings, just using that as a mask for like an emissive. And same, you can control the shapes, like those wouldn't make much sense, but you could keep only one if you want, more like window shape or dots. So yeah, this is a pretty useful software. About my texturing workflow for large scale scenes or objects, in this particular project something that helps is having the same texture base and look for almost everything in the scene. Then I make variations of those materials and I tweak the color, roughness, the texture scale or the edge breakup mask. Now, because this is a dystopian sci-fi environment, this monochromatic uniform look makes sense and works fine, but this might not be the case for all types of environments. Usually the more variations and breakups, the better. Now, something that comes with texturing large elements is styling in the textures. So on this massive structure, for example, I have a texture of windows, and if I left it by default, it will look really repetitive and tiled, even though I'm mixing 3 different types of windows. So in this case I just use textures as masks and noise to break up the visible repetition pattern of the windows. But for other types of textures, mostly for ground, terrain, organic textures, usually if you set the texture scale to work in the foreground, it will create a really tiled and repetitive effect as it goes in the distance, but setting it to work in the distance will just make the texture way too large and low resolution blurry in the foreground. So for that, a good technique is to use distance blending. I will link a video showcasing this method in details, but basically you can use the depth in your camera information to create masks and have different texture scales for different distances from the camera. Now, using textures to fake details. Something else that got noticed on Reddit was that the geometry of the main structure was really basic, but in the render it looks very detailed. For that, the JSplacement maps were important. I used these details as bump, plugged in the normal of my shader, and I set the value pretty high for elements in the distance and a bit lower for the city buildings. Another thing that adds details is having layers. It is also really simple geometry. I just duplicated a ring of faces from the main structure, slightly move it away, and on this geometry I applied the material using a JSplacement texture, but also using an alpha from this texture, to break up that uniform plane and fake a detailed geometry. You can add multiple layers of those to get even more details, but keep in mind that alpha is still gonna cost a little bit of performance in the end in the render. And don't forget to up the amount of transparency bounces if you have layers of alphas. You can also add layers of details with simple geometries and the wireframe modifier. To make some types of metal structures, especially if you have a shot in movement, it will give some parallax effect to have more layers and give a sense of complexity to your elements. Another question was, if I use asset packs, how much of it is my own work? So for this project, the only elements I have not made myself were a few small props to detail the train and some of the rooftops. They were from free greeble packs on Blender Swap from Spacehead, I will link it in the description. The ships are also actually made from these greebles, just throwing a few geos together to get some ship shapes. And the character clothes were from Sketchfab, I will also link it in the description. But everything else, from the buildings to the main structures, the main parts of the train, it was all made from scratch, but it is all very basic modeling. It's just insets, extrudes, bevels, nothing fancy. How long did this project take me? So this project took me overall a bit over 2 weeks to make, but with days without working on it at all, other days barely touching it. So I would say a week of actual work on this project. As for render times, I rendered this image in 2 layers, the CG without volumetrics and then the volumetrics pass only, with the geometries as holdout. It allows for less noise and a bit more control in post. Each render layer took around 10 to 15 minutes to render. I rendered a 4:5 ratio, I initially put 4000 by 5000 and only rendered half res, so I got a 2000 by 2500 pixel image. 400 samples were just fine, transparency enabled, so I have more control to put the sky I want in post. And finally, how to do big projects without your PC crashing, or what are my PC stats? Well, first, optimizing geometry, not adding unnecessary modeling details if it's not clearly visible, instancing your geometry instead of duplicating, so using Alt-D instead of Shift-D, like the second main structure in my scene is just an instance of the collection of the first one, so that second one is not gonna add anything to the memory. Adding details only where needed, focusing only on what is visible through the camera. If we look at my scene on the right side, there is absolutely nothing past that little row of buildings. You can also separate your render passes, like I did with the volumetrics. This can help when you launch your render to not run out of memory if there is too many things to calculate at once. But you can also do the extra steps that I could have done for this project and separate your scene in different layers and work on those layers in separate Blender scenes. It just requires a bit more scene management and logistics. I haven't done it for any of my projects so far, but I will link a video by Miche, another French 3D artist that recently got into the top 5 of the Eternal Ascent Challenge, and he talks about this approach that he used for his project. As for my PC setup, it is really not particularly crazy good. I am planning on updating it this year, but for now I have a RTX 2060 GPU and 32GB of RAM, and on this project I clearly had a bunch of crashes and even total PC freeze that were quite annoying. So that's about it for this video. Let me know if there is something you would like me to cover more in details on this project. I haven't gone too much in details about my scattering setups or my post-process in Photoshop, for example. So if that's something you would like to see, let me know. Otherwise, the next step for me on this project will be to make an animated version. I already have a first animated camera for it, but this will require doing a lot more work, adding details in areas that we were not seeing so far, like the right side of the city, the transition from terrain to city at the beginning of the shot, animating the ships, but I will take a break from this project first and I will come back to it later. Make sure to subscribe to see when I post something new and let me know what you think about this type of content in the comments. It's the first time I'm doing this type of video, so let me know how I did and let me know if there is anything in particular you would like to see. Otherwise, follow me here on Instagram or ArtStation to see my future projects, and thanks for watching.